This is the fifth time to have had the privilege of speaking to your congregation. Of course, it was at the funeral home. I think the first three times. And anyway, I don't know for sure how it developed, or I don't know the details of how it developed, but I was contacted a while back, and whoever, and I'm sorry, I apologize, I don't remember who it was who contacted me.
Michelle Bowen.
Okay, there we go, yes. She contacted me and said that she had found the description of a sermon that I had preached previously, and that they thought, and she thought that would be really nice if I could come back and present that sermon here. Well, I told her, well, I preached that sermon here already. The first time I was here, I preached that sermon, which is a Universalism, past, present, and powerful. And but we discussed it some more and decided you have a lot of new members who wouldn't have heard that first time. And if you're like me, you probably don't remember a lot of the details, because I don't remember when it was, somewhere between 10 and 15 years ago when I first spoke. So some of this might sound a bit familiar to you. Maybe if you have a really good memory, maybe a lot of it will, for those of you who've heard me before. It is indeed a high privilege for me to be here. And Joe, I just appreciate your leadership. He has a wonderful spirit, don't you think? And it's a high joy and pleasure and privilege to be here. When I served the United Methodist Church in Dallas Center, Iowa, I became acquainted with the UU minister in Des Moines. And when she realized that I believed in Universalism, she invited me to attend a special service that the church was going to be having. And it was going to be in the small town of Mitchellville, which is a few miles east of Des Moines. And it's going to be in a church building that originally housed a Universalist congregation. There was not a congregation there anymore, but that church in Des Moines had one service each summer at that church in Mitchellville as a way of celebrating their Universalist heritage. So I was happy to join them for that service. And I'll always remember, as I walked up the walk in front of that church, over the door it read, Universalist Church. And I thought, I have arrived at home. Universalism has been really important to me for a long time, and that's why I wrote a book on the subject, and that's why I travel around the country with my wife, Darlene, speaking on Universalism. Today I'm going to be speaking on the history and the significance of the teaching of Universalism. It is sometimes referred to as universal salvation. So I'm going to present a definition of salvation that's probably different from what you've heard from other sources. You're probably aware that at least among conservative Christians, their definition of salvation would be to accept Jesus as your personal savior so you can go to heaven when you die. Well, apparently that definition works for many people. But to me, it's not very adequate because it doesn't necessarily involve any change or growth. So I've come up with a definition that works for me. And that is, salvation is to learn and grow either with or without divine influence so as to experience fullness of life in this life and beyond. Correct. And if you don't believe in the divine, or if you don't believe in life after death, you can just leave those parts off the definition. And so to me, the most basic understanding of salvation is to learn and grow so as to experience fullness of life. So in contrast to what a lot of people believe, I reject the idea that many people are going to suffer forever in hell. Instead, I believe that everyone will eventually experience salvation or fullness of life. And for certain individuals, if that doesn't take place in this lifetime, I believe it will take place sometime beyond. During the time of Jesus, the conventional thinking of the day, or the most of the religions of the day, taught that a lot of people would spend eternity suffering in hell. But there were at least a couple of exceptions to that. One was the Zoroastrians. Perhaps you're familiar with them. The Zoroastrian faith developed in the 5th and the 6th centuries in the area of Persia, which is where the current country of Iran is. Anyway, those Zoroastrians were Universalists. Isn't that wonderful? So this is not a new idea. It's been around for at least 2,500 years, probably a lot longer than that. Also, in contrast to the conventional thinking of the day, Jesus also did not teach eternal damnation, but taught universalism. In the environment, though, where the conventional thinking was that a lot of people would spend eternity in hell, it's sometimes difficult to convince people otherwise. So there were some people who professed to be followers of Jesus, but at the same time held on to their belief of endless suffering of many people beyond death. But there were a lot of the early Christians who did believe in universalism. Of course, we can't go back and poll them, but from my study of history, of church history, it seems to me that it was at least the majority and probably the vast majority of the early Christians did believe in universalism. A couple of examples of that would have been Clement and Origen of Alexandria, two of the most prominent theologians in the early church. Others included Gregory of Nyssa, Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, and many others as well. As I said, there were some people who professed to be followers of Jesus, but weren't fully converted to Christianity. One example of that would have been Tertullian. He became a Christian at age 40, and he held on to his belief of endless suffering of many people beyond death. In fact, he so relished the idea of other people, it's always other people, not himself, but he so relished the idea of other people suffering in hell that he said he believed that one of the best things about heaven would be the superb view of the damned frying in hell. Isn't that awful? How can you even comprehend something like that? But it is so astonishing, a person who professed to be a follower of Jesus, a follower of the one who taught so much about love and peace and compassion and forgiveness and so on, could so relish the idea of so many people suffering excruciating torment in hell forever. The theologian Augustine was another example of a person who wasn't fully converted to Christianity. He became a Christian at age 32 and held on to his belief of endless suffering of many people beyond death. But Augustine was a pretty decent theologian in many respects, so it's not surprising that his theology started to become dominant in the church. He lived in the latter part of the 4th century and into the 5th century. And so it's not surprising that by the 6th century, there was coming to be quite a controversy over the issue of universalism. In order to resolve this controversy, the Roman Emperor Justinian called a church meeting. It was the 5th Ecumenical Council in the year 553. Now, does it seem a little strange to you that a Roman emperor would call a church meeting? Well, it makes perfect sense when you think about the fact that emperors like to control people. Isn't that a given? Emperors like to control people, and they had learned that threatening people with eternal damnation was a foolproof means of controlling them. And so they called this council in order to resolve the difference. And of course, this idea of threatening people with eternal damnation as a means of controlling people, that probably sounds familiar to you, because a lot of churches still employ that technique yet today. And so the emperor allied himself with the Hellraisers of the day to try to abolish this teaching, and they were ones who would threaten the Hellraisers. They would threaten the Universalists of the day, those free-spirited Universalists, with eternal damnation, and they didn't take it seriously. And so out of frustration, the emperor allied himself with the Hellraisers, and together they pushed through the teaching of unending suffering of people in hell. And they abolished the teaching of universalism. Now, with all the powers of the church as well as the state against the teaching, it's not surprising that it died out or went dormant or went underground after that. And that lasted for a long time, really for about 1,000 years. But you can't suppress the truth indefinitely, right? Eventually it'll start bubbling up someplace. And that's what happened about 300 years ago. It really started more than 300 years ago. But it was about 300 years ago that it once again became a strong movement. John Wesley, who was the primary organizer and leader of the Methodist movement back in the 18th century, he had a close association with a group of Christians called Moravians. And the Moravians were Universalists. Another wonderful bit of history, right? But anyway, John Wesley disagreed with them on that point, and he would argue strenuously against them on the issue of universalism and a couple of other subjects. But it seems that they eventually wore him down because Wesley maintained his association with the Moravians, and he eventually came to believe in Universalism himself. Now, I'd love to tell United Methodists that John Wesley eventually came to believe in Universalism. And that is because in the United Methodist Church, the most conservative people are ones who are most likely to reject the teaching of Universalism, and they also can often be heard to say, let's go back and reestablish the teachings of John Wesley. And I say, yeah, let's do that, because he eventually came to believe in Universalism. The American colonies proved to be particularly fertile ground for the spread of the teaching of Universalism. George de Benneville came over from France in 1741, and he was a physician, and he did quite a bit to spread the teaching of Universalism in eastern Pennsylvania and in New Jersey and in Maryland. John Murray came over from England in 1770, and he worked closely with the Quakers and the Baptists in spreading the teaching of Universalism throughout the American colonies. It was under Murray's leadership that the Universalist Church in America was organized. There were many prominent women leaders in this modern version of the Universalist Church. One of them was Olympia Brown. She was the first woman to be ordained by any denomination, and first woman to be ordained by any denomination, when she was ordained by the Universalist Church in 1863. Now, we United Methodists started ordaining women in 1956, and I felt really good about that, considering that there are some churches that still don't ordain women. I felt really good about us starting to ordain women in 1956, until I realized that the Universalists beat us by almost 100 years when they ordained Olympia Brown in 1863. Hosea Blue was the most prominent leader and theologian during his life and ministry. When he died in 1852, the Universalist Church had about 800,000 members. So it was a strong movement, to be sure. The teaching of Universalism hasn't been promoted only by Universalists or Unitarians, for that matter, but has been promoted by other leaders and theologians of other denominations as well. For example, in the 19th century, there was a German theologian named Friedrich Schleiermacher. I wonder, how many people here have heard of old Friedrich? Anybody here heard of Friedrich Schleiermacher? I guess not. That's pretty much normal. I find maybe it's 2% of the people that I speak to have heard of Friedrich Schleiermacher. But anyway, he is certainly a fine theologian and a strong advocate of Universalism. And besides that, I just like to say his name. Friedrich Schleiermacher. Isn't that a name to be envied? Don't know what there is about that name, but I love the name of Friedrich Schleiermacher. But anyway, there were other leaders and theologians during the 20th century that taught Universalism, even though they wouldn't necessarily use the word Universalism, but that's what they taught. Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Leslie Weatherhead, and many others as well. So the teaching of Universalism has a long, rich history. For more than 500 years, think about that, that's a long time, for more than 500 years following the time of Jesus, and then especially again for the last 300 years as well. So you might wonder, why is this such an important issue for me as a United Methodist minister? Is that really not a part of our doctrine in the United Methodist Church? So why is it that I wrote a book and travel around the country speaking on this? Well, obviously, it seems to me that the teaching of a God of eternal damnation has prevailed for far too long throughout our country, in most churches and in our society at large, and with devastating consequences. One of the reasons this is so important to me is because the teaching of a God of eternal damnation turns many people away from God. They know that they would never ever punish their own children without end. I mean, it is literally an insane concept, right? Because we know what happens to people who torture their own children. They either end up in prison or a mental hospital. Yet they say that's what God will do to naughty people forever, torturing them forever. It is literally an insane concept. And so the teaching of a God of eternal damnation turns many people away from God. Sometimes they become atheists. Now, I need to acknowledge that I've learned a lot about atheism from UUs, and I'm grateful. Okay. Anyway, when we went on the road, that's like 20 years ago. This summer, beginning July the 1st, that's when I began my speaking ministry around the country. So we're coming up on 20 years. But anyway, I knew a little bit about atheism when we went on the road, but I didn't know much. And one of the high points of speaking at UU churches is that I've met a lot of wonderful atheists. I didn't expect that. I thought atheists surely must be sad people. And but how wrong I was. And so I've met a lot of wonderful atheists, and I've met a lot of wonderful people in UU churches of a great variety of faiths. And that's a wonderful thing. But for some of them, they find atheism to be a thoughtful, responsible, mature way to approach life, and it works for them. For people for whom atheism works, I really don't have a difficulty with that. But in other denominations, when people become atheists, it often is not such a positive thing. And that is because they still sometimes have in the back of their mind the possibility of spending eternity in hell. And if there's no God to rescue them from that plight, then they sometimes conclude that they are doomed. And that can lead to despair and meaninglessness. We all want to make the world a better place. That's what motivates me more than anything else to travel around the country, to try to make the world a better place. And it seems to me, though, that we can't make very much progress in that regard as long as the teaching of a God of eternal damnation continues to prevail in most churches and in society at large. And the reason for that is because people's perception of God has a powerful and direct influence on how they live their lives. If people believe that God is judgmental and condemning and cruel, it's very, very easy to justify living that same way themselves. It's like the old song, one tin soldier goes, "Go ahead and hate your neighbor. Go ahead and cheat a friend. Do it in the name of heaven. You can justify it in the end." Sadly, I see people in our own country and around the world who seek to justify evil behavior in the name of heaven, in the name of God. And it's much easier to do that if you believe that God is judgmental and condemning and cruel. On the other hand, if you believe that God is loving and kind and merciful and gracious and patient and so on, then we're much more likely to live according to those standards. I believe this is of enormous significance. I believe that if we're going to change the world for the better, perhaps the most important single thing that we need to do is to change people's perception of God. There's a man named Robert Short who wrote a book called Something to Believe In. And one of the things he says in that book is that people tend to resemble the gods they serve. I think that's profound. People tend to resemble the gods they serve. And so I believe what we need to do more than anything else, if we want to change the world for the better, is to change people's perception of God from being judgmental and condemning and cruel to that of loving. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was sometimes criticized because he loved his enemies too much. He was told, "You shouldn't love your enemies, you should seek to destroy them." To which Lincoln replied, "Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends?" Isn't that powerful?
Yes.
Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends? Abraham Lincoln was a Universalist. He believed in the power of love and the preciousness of each individual and that everyone would eventually be saved. And what a difference that made in how he lived his life. And because of that, he could love even his enemies. It seems to me those of us who also believe in universalism, we are called to live in that same way. We're called to rise above being judgmental and condemning and cruel in order to transform the world through love. So we who believe in universalism, who believe in the preciousness of each individual, who believe in the power of love, have a wonderful message to share with the world, and it's important that we do so. Again, Robert Short, in his book, Something to Believe In, He says that there is too much at stake for us to allow ourselves to be intimidated by the wrathful self-righteousness of the hell-raising gloomy doomies. Isn't that a mouthful? There is too much at stake for us to allow ourselves to be intimidated by the wrathful self-righteousness of the hell-raising gloomy doomies. And then he goes on to say, therefore, our witness to them should be just as aggressive and unambiguous as theirs has been to us. Fundamentalists can be intimidating, can't they? They go around quoting the Bible and asking people whether or not they're saved. So they can be intimidating. But I say, let's not be intimidated. After all, we are the ones with the good news. They, in contrast, spread a teaching that is divisive and leads to cruel and inhumane behavior and justifies abuse. With their understanding of things, it's perfectly okay to torture people, whether that's at Guantanamo Bay or wherever. After all, they believe that God will torture people forever because they were naughty. If it's okay for God to torture people, surely it must be okay for us to do it. Besides, the torture that we might inflict upon others is nothing compared to the torture that they believe that God will inflict upon people forever in a literal lake of fire, no less. So we who believe in love, the power of love, we who believe in the preciousness of each individual, we believe in the wonderful message of universalism. I have a great message to share with the world. So it's important that we not be intimidated. The teaching of God of eternal damnation leads to wars and racism and oppression and abuse, while the spread of the teaching of universalism leads to equality, respect, love, and dignity for all. So I say, let's not be intimidated. Instead, let us freely and boldly proclaim to the world the wonderful message of universalism, and the world will be infinitely better off because of it. Amen. Amen.